Good day, everyone, wherever you are listening or watching from. So glad that you are here. It's a pleasure to have you for this sort of very special event that we're doing today with my friend Jeff Brown, who I'll introduce. You'll see him there, but I'll introduce him in a second. So first of all, I'm glad that you're here. And since you're here, I hope that you will engage with us, which means type away on the comments of whatever social platform you're in. And the easiest thing to do first is just tell us where you're from. Just say hello and tell us where you're from. Jeff and I would love to know that. And those that you are with would love to know that as well. And that'll get you used to using your fingers because we'll get through that. So as we go, I mean, if you have a question during this conversation, just imagine, I say this on my podcast as well. Like if you were joining us around a table having a conversation, if you had a question, you'd ask it. If you had a comment, you'd share it. If you had an idea, you'd offer it. And I hope that you'll do that in this virtual setting as well. And so say hello and then join in whenever and however you'd like. We're doing this series of conversations to help celebrate our 30 years in business. So it's been just about 30 years and 10 days ago. As we're sitting here now, I turned in my keys, I turned in my badge, and I started the journey that became the Kevin Eikenberry Group, and to have the chance to lead the team that I lead and work with the leaders that we work with around the world. And as a part of that celebration, we wanted to do something that would be beneficial to you, and that was to bring smart people to join me. And there's lots of times, obviously, where I'm interviewing folks. In fact, this gentleman that I'm with today, I've interviewed on my podcast, and he's interviewed me on his podcast. But today we're going to do a different sort of thing where I'm going to turn the mic over to him in a second. We're just going to talk about this idea of unleashing our knowledge. How do we take the things we're learning and turn it into action? And this topic came up out of a conversation that Jeff and I had. And so in this series that we're doing, I thought about who would I want to have join me? And Jeff was one of those people. And so let me introduce Jeff, tell you a little bit about him, and then we'll dive in. So in 2013, Jeff Brown left his 26-year career in broadcasting and launched a podcast back when podcasting wasn't cool. It was called the Read to Lead podcast. And that show has been named a top 3 career podcast on Apple Podcasts. It's been nominated for Best Business Podcast Awards. And for over 10 years, he's been doing this. He's done over 500 or around 500 episodes. The show's success led to a book titled, not surprisingly, Read to Lead, the simple habit that expands your influence and boosts your career. That book has been a top 3 book on Amazon. It has 4.5 stars on Amazon, all super good stuff, worthy of every one of those stars. I can tell you that. He does virtual and in-person speaking and workshops. He evangelizes leaders and teams on the benefits of lifelong learning and professional development. He's talked to organizations like LinkedIn and Disney and lots more. He and I sort of share this passion for learning and for reading. And that's why I've brought him here to join us. And I'm going to turn the mic around, sort of let him lead. We're going to just have a conversation, but I'm going to let him sort of ask the questions and he and I will talk about it. I'm going to let you know that if you want to reach out to him, I'm going to put these links up here if I can get my mouse to the right spot. There's the Read to Lead podcast, readtoleadpodcast.com, and wherever your podcasts are found. And you can learn more about Jeff at jeffbrown.me. And so, Jeff, thanks for joining me. And I'm going to let you sort of take the lead. We'll have this conversation for a little bit.
Well, again, thank you so much for having me. I said that before we started, but I want to say it publicly. I'm so excited to be here to talk to you about this topic and to get your insights on something that I am truly passionate about. On my website, I talk about sort of the reason I started the Read to Lead podcast, and I'm such a big believer in books, is that I have seen that those have helped me go from intention to implementation. But still, a lot of people struggle. A lot of people we all consume lots and lots of information every day. We've gone from information scarcity to information abundance, and I would argue super abundance, to the point where there's so much, it's almost like scarcity because you can't find anything in either one of those scenarios oftentimes, right? When it comes to the things that you've read about and you've learned and you want to implement. And so one of the things I want to dive in with you today is just some of the strategies and tactics you use to make sure, with everything that comes at you every day, the things that you find interesting, the books that you read, the podcasts you listen to. How do you manage all the information such that, or do you? Maybe that's a better question, such that it doesn't overwhelm you. So let's start there with regard to just information overload. What are some of your strategies for making sure that it doesn't become overwhelming? Any tricks or tips there you could share?
Well, step one, you're better at this than me. I would say that's why I think it's so great you and I are having this conversation. I think there are a few things. I love your idea of moving from intention to implementation. I just finished recording in our studio downstairs. I just finished recording what will be an episode of our Remarkable TV, which I talked about the idea of the knowing doing gap, which the reason I probably thought about writing that script and recording that today was because I knew we were going to have this conversation because it's connected, right? It's the idea that there's a difference between what we know and that what we go actually implement, right? And so I think there's two big parts in what you're asking. And the first one is there is so much, excuse me, and we have to recognize that. But I think the first thing that helps me is that I try to be really clear on the lens that I'm consuming through. So, Ben Franklin said, I'm going to work on each one of these 13 virtues a week at a time. And then I'm going to repeat that 4 times a year, right? So 13 virtues, 52 weeks. And I've long used that idea, but more on a monthly or quarterly basis. So for any given month, I could tell you what is the thing that I'm most wanting to be learning or getting better at. So that helps me to parse out some of the stuff I take in, but it also helps me when I'm reading something because, one of the coolest things about all of the stuff we have coming at us is that the lens that we look at it through will have an impact, Jeff, on what we take from it, right? So we can both watch the same movie and it's like we saw 2 different movies, right? And we could both read the same book and take very different things from it. Right. And it has to do with the lens that we're watching or reading through. So I think one of my tips is to be reading with intention about what it is you really try to be learning, because you'll find connections in that moment.
Yeah, it's something I often tell my listeners and those in my community is, and I talk about this in the Read to Lead book as well, and it kind of goes along with what you're saying, is before sitting down to, say, consume a piece of content, in particular a book, is to set a goal and at least ask yourself, why am I reading this? What is it I want to get out of it? And actually write that down, and then look at the contents of the table of contents or what have you, and ask yourself, okay, what chapters might lend themselves to that goal? And maybe nonfiction anyway, I can start there. I don't necessarily have to start at the beginning. And once I've read those chapters, have I gotten what I needed? And if the answer is yes, you've got permission to move on.
Well, there's a big permission point right there, because there's a lot of people, and I used to be there too. Like, well, you didn't read the book until you read it all. That I don't believe that's right at all. Now, it's interesting that you say that, because both of us, are also podcasters, and I know that both of us don't have a conversation with someone on our podcast unless we've read the book. To your point, Jeff, that doesn't mean I've necessarily read every single page every time. But it's interesting that you say that, because when I'm reading for that purpose, and I was showing you a book earlier that I just did recently, and you see all these little notes along the side of it. When I pick up the book knowing it's going to be on the podcast, that's goal number 1. Where do I find the nuggets that will make for hopefully a great show? And I always set the goal of finding stuff that not everyone else is asking them. But the challenge for me in that moment is I'm consuming, let's say, 50 of these a year, but it's to making sure that I'm also getting what I want out of it beyond the podcast, right? Which is an extra challenge, but not one that necessarily everyone has, right? My other challenge there is that there's other stuff that I want to be reading to my learning goal for our business's objectives. So I can't just stop at 50, which is a whole other challenge, right? That's a different conversation, I suppose.
I feel your pain. Yes, I very much identify with that. You mentioned the Franklin 13 virtues, and I was reminded as you're talking, one great method I have found to sift through the hordes of information coming at us every day something that late physicist, Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman talks about, and that's identifying your 12 favorite problems. He says it doesn't necessarily have to be 12, but actually writing down what are the problems, your favorite problems you want to see solved in the not too distant future, and then when stuff comes at you, using those things as a lens through which to filter them, and if they don't speak to one of those, well, maybe that's not something you need to be consuming. Maybe you can move on to something else. Do you have a thought about that?
And I love that. If I had heard that before, I didn't remember it, so I wrote it down, as you might have noticed as you were talking. So I love that, and I think I'm in a stage right now where I'm working on my next book, and so that same thing happens, right? Like I know what the big pieces of that book are going to be, and yet I'm finding that everything I'm reading, I'm finding those connections. Like that's connected to there, and that's connected to there, and there's an idea there that I want to be able to potentially flesh out, or at least goes into the bucket of things for me to think about as it relates to that. So I think that's right. And so whether it's 13 virtues, whether it's 12 questions, whether it's your current learning goal, whatever it is, it's that first part of what you said. It's that intention piece. It's so important because, and in fact, and I think you and I have talked about this, that I read so much nonfiction, and I don't read enough fiction. And I don't say that to feel guilty, although I sometimes do feel kind of guilty about that, because when I do read fiction, I always enjoy it. And yet I don't find myself reading it enough. However, if I'm reading it, and I'm reading it for pleasure, I understand that, but I'm reading all these other books for pleasure too, really. But again, if I have that intention, if I have that filter, things will show up there for me as well, which I think is powerful. Well.
I want to stick to this information overload for just a second longer, if we can. I know in my younger days, before I sort of became, I guess, an expert on, after years and years of failing miserably, note taking and just the practice of making sure that what I'm writing down today is going to be useful to future me later. Is this problem that I ran into with categorizing and organizing things by topic and subtopic, and what that led to, and I was using Evernote at the time for my sort of second brain, if you will. What that led to was just over 100 folders with multiple subfolders. And every time I would consume something new, if there wasn't a folder it fit into, you're thinking of all these things that you don't need to be thinking about when you're trying to really, in your own mind, expound on what it is you've learned and put that in your own words, so you're not just, regurgitating something somebody else said. And I have found it super valuable to, with regard to topic and subtopic, is to think more like the context in which this information might be used. In other words, the primary question when deciding where to put something becomes, in which context will I want to stumble upon this again in the future, rather than where does it need to go now? So instead of filing things away according to where they came from, you're filing them according to where they're going. Does that resonate with you? And if so, how do you sort of manage that?
It does. And this goes back to this idea that I know that you're better at this than me, in part because you've been working really hard on this note-taking stuff, and I've already told you that eventually I'm probably going to take your class in that regard. And I'm guessing if people go to jeffbrown.me, they'll find out they can learn more about that. Here's the thing. I could be way better at that. And what you said, one of the things you said is useful to all of us, regardless of whether we sort of go down the trail that you've gone down and learned about all of that. And that is thinking about what I'm learning in the context of when I'll use it. So Jeff, one of the things I ask at the end of every episode of our podcast is, now what? Right? I'm done asking questions of the guest or my colleague, and I'm asking the audience, okay, what are you going to do with what you learned? Right? If we can have the information, and we can even get better at categorizing it and being able to retrieve it, if you will. but it's still just an academic exercise until we are going to turn that learning
Mm.
into action. What I wrote this morning for this episode was that knowledge, something along these lines, knowledge might be powerful. Knowledge might be power. Okay, we all hear that. But informed action based on the knowledge is way more powerful than
Absolutely.
just putting it away. So like
Mm.
the struggle that you were describing was the one of the academic. I want to capture all this. This is really good. I love this even, but I need to capture it. But there isn't a test. But there's a context in which I will use it later. And so I love that, framing it as how will this be useful to me and how will I use it? So say a little bit more about that in terms of that context as opposed to topic.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of something called the PARA model, PARA, which has been popularized or invented, maybe is the better word. I think this is his original idea. PARA being projects, areas of responsibility, resources, and archives. And so, whenever you come across a piece of information that you want to save or that you want to develop further or write about, it's probably going to go in or fit in one of those 4 folders. So at the end of the day, you don't need 100+ folders in Evernote like I had. You need really 4 that are going to have some subfolders, yes, but 4 main folders. And so
say them again. Projects.
Yeah, projects, areas, resources, and archives. This is, again, popularized by Tiago Forte. There are other methods for this. One is maps of content, which we don't have to get into, but PARA is fairly popular. In fact, so popular that he followed up his book from last year with a book that takes PARA out, and he's written a book just about PARA, by the way. But with regard to then how those folders work and the information you're taking in, you ask yourself, well, what project would this be useful for? When you think about, where do I want to come across this next? That's question number 1. If there isn't one, you ask yourself, well, which area would this be useful for? And areas are areas of responsibility. Projects are goals with deadlines, right? And areas are things in your life that you have ongoing responsibilities in. And then if it doesn't fit an area, then you ask yourself, well, which resource does this belong to? And if it doesn't fit there, then you might ask yourself, well, okay, do I even need to save this? Do I even need to capture this in the first place? And as you go across those 4 projects, areas, resources, archives, projects are things that are most actionable, right? You're probably checking that folder weekly or maybe daily. Then slightly less actionable is areas, and then slightly less actionable is resources, and then least actionable would be archives. And so that's a great, very simple, easy to understand method for most people to get out of the world of a folder for every tiny little topic and subtopic, and dealing with just those 4 major areas of responsibility, knowing that you're going to have subfolders under each. But that's a game changer for a lot of people.
And again, the book that was written there, let's just say that again so people get it.
Yeah, Tiago's book that came out last year was called Building a Second Brain. And he and I, he's got a course he teaches on this topic, just like I do. And then I can't remember the exact title of the PARA book that came out in August, but it's a book just about this organization technique called PARA.
I've read the first one, but I didn't even know the second one existed. So
yeah, he's just an excellent teacher, and he's been doing this longer than I have, but at least as far as like a formalized course.
Right.
But I talk about PARA in my cohort in note-making mastery, just because I think it's so useful and so powerful. We also talk about maps of content, which is another way to organize information, but most people lean toward, most knowledge workers anyway, seem to lean toward PARA.
So, okay, so I'm capturing data, I'm categorizing it maybe in some new ways, but from your perspective, how do we make sure we're using that, going from knowing to doing, right? Going from knowledge to action, like going from, as you said, from intention to implementation. Like, what have you learned in that regard?
Yeah, I think there's some discipline that's involved here all throughout this process. So when I
What?
talk, when
We
I
have to be disciplined?
yeah, when I talk about these concepts, a lot of times students will say, "Well, gosh, this seems like a lot of work," and it is. And when you put the level of work into it, I suggest the first thing that happens is you consume less because it's work.
Because you can't.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a good thing. There's this the sort of idea of the fear of missing out. I flipped that on its head and said, well, let's practice the joy of missing out. Let's practice JOMO instead of FOMO, and leverage things like selective ignorance. Right? We don't have to keep tabs on everything under the sun. And so once you've captured something, once you've dealt with it from an organizational standpoint, the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to distill that, or I use the word crystallize. You're going to want to take that thing that person said or wrote, and really determine what that means to you. How would you frame that? How would you state that? And write it in your own words. It's really important. And I try to do this when taking notes from books, is to not just write down verbatim something the author said. Now, there are sometimes something they say that's really pithy that I want to capture because
Right.
it's said just so. But oftentimes I want to take things and think about, okay, if I were teaching this to somebody else, how would it come out of me? And let me write it down that way. And also let me write it down as if I'm writing it for someone else who didn't have the benefit of consuming the content that I did, because future me is someone else, right? So when I come across this content again, it's going to need to be written in such a way that future me doesn't have to, start all over again to figure out what this means, because that cognitive overload is going to cause us to just walk away.
There's another related point there, Jeff, and that is that when we put it in our own words, right, or when we put it into our context, we also now own it. We didn't just copy down what someone else said, even if what they said was awesome and pithy, right? But now we own it. Like when I teach a workshop, which I do all the time, right? Like I often will tell people, I want you to talk to others about it. Or even during a workshop, we'll have a breakout group, or if we're in a physical room, we'll have table groups talking about stuff. Talk about what you just got, what was valuable, how you will use it, how will you apply this in your work. And that's turning that into ownership, which is half of the battle, to take what we're learning and using it, right? Is we have to contextualize it, which is one of the things that you already said, but we also have to own it. So it isn't something some other smart dude or dudette said, but what it means to me.
Exactly. Yeah.
I love that. It's really
cool. And once we've done that, it becomes a lot easier, and I would say exciting then, to use these little bits and parts and pieces we have as building blocks to create something brand new, because what's in my notes is going to be very different than what's in your notes, and what's the things that are crashing into one another is going to be different than what's crashing into one another in your system, because I've consumed different content, right? And so the beauty of this, and a lot of it happens serendipitously, is when we take these things and we break them down and we add our own spin or put our own words on them, what often happens is pieces of content that were seemingly disparate at the time are suddenly playing in the same sandbox, and boom, an idea strikes that is very unique to you, because you're the one person putting these things together that nobody else is. And out of that comes that really, truly original thing or idea, but it started with someone else's thoughts. You're just bringing, again, different ones together that have a chance to in your system, as I like to say, crash into one another.
Yeah, I love that metaphor, crashing in. We're planting all these different seeds, and then whatever we've planted in our mental garden has the chance to cross-pollinate differently, right? So that's the farmer in Kevin coming out. Right? So I don't know. I'm guessing that other people struggle with this. I struggle with this as well. And, you and I are in the same boat in that we are producers of podcasts, and I'm confident that you've gotten the same feedback I've gotten, is that, Kevin, your podcast is very useful, very valuable, and there's a lot of information there. So like reading a book, like if I'm reading a book though, I can stop and I can take that note, or I can type up that note, or I can do whatever. But if I'm consuming podcasts while I'm exercising, while I'm driving, whatever, like what's your advice for, man, I got this really great stuff. Do you have any thoughts about that? Do we not worry about it? Do we just let that wash over us in those moments? What are your thoughts about that? So it's advice for people listening to us, but not just us, like to podcasts. I mean, it's one thing if you're listening to true crime or you're listening to entertainment, which is perfectly fine. But if you're listening to what we'll call, professional development, content rich podcasts, or even like this conversation, like what is your advice to people there? How do you advise people around that?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways I would recommend approaching that, depending on the tools that you ultimately want to use. And if you, with regard to any kind of content you consume, this first one applies, and then I'll give you a podcast specific process you can use. So this first one again applies to any kind of content you consume, and that's just landing on some type of notes app. And I think, though I'm a lover of writing by hand, and I'll often write notes from books by hand as I'm reading them, I think it's very important to capture those things ultimately in a digital tool so that those things can crash into one another more easily, like we talked about before. And so one of the things that Niklas Luhmann talks about, he's sort of the father of the Zettelkasten method of note taking. We don't have time to get into all that, but a part of that process is the fleeting note. And this is just a fancy way of talking about kind of those shower ideas, those epiphanies like you talked about that come to us out of nowhere. And it's important to have, and a lot of notes apps accommodate this, but if not, you can create your own. And that's this concept of just a daily note. Have a template called a daily note in your system that it wouldn't be a bad idea to just open up in the morning and just have sitting there in the background. So, and you can duplicate this on your phone as well, if you're using a notes app, presumably that works on all your platforms, so that when those fleeting thoughts come, you can jot those down in your daily note quickly, and just don't worry about categorizing them or doing anything else. Just get them down. And then the discipline we talked about comes in when either at the end of the day or the beginning of the next day, you're taking 30 minutes or less. Let me go through my fleeting notes from today. What is here that I want to hang on to, and what have I sensed? I'm not getting that dopamine hit anymore from it. A few hours later, I can delete that.
We don't have to hoard these; they can go away, right?
That's exactly right. We, like a piece of paper you wad up and throw in the trash. We can get rid of it. Or is there something here that's still resonating with me? And if so, okay, now in this sort of 20, 30 minute time I've set aside to do just this, I can think that way and figure out what I want to do with this. So that works really for no matter the content you're consuming. And with regard to podcasts specifically, I don't often do this, but in my years of podcast listening, I have come across, and I have no vested interest in this. Let me just say this right up front. I have come across an app called, and it's sort of unfortunately named in one way. It's called Snipped. I won't go into why it's unfortunately named, but you can
SNIPP.
Well, it's SNIPD, SNIPD, and this is a podcast listening app specifically for those of us who listen to podcasts we like to learn from. And if I open up the Read to Lead podcast in this app, and this is not the case for all podcasts, but I was a beta user and tester, and so I got in early as a podcaster. If you open up the Read to Lead podcast to the latest episode, you'll find a transcript created inside the app for that podcast. So as you're listening, if something sticks out to you, you can just, using your finger, touch the screen and say, I want to snip this. And it will capture that content and then sync it to your notes app in the background without you having to do anything. And now they're doing, this is brand new, which I love, and they seem to be including podcasts like mine in this as well, and adding others as they go. They're now not only developing AI-generated written summaries of podcasts, but now audio versions of those written summaries. So you not only get the podcast and a full transcript in the app, but a transcript summary and an audio summary of that transcript summary. So
Right.
all this in that one app. And I don't think there's a better, for those of us specifically who like to listen to podcasts for learning and growth, professional development, that there's no app quite like it in all that allows you to do. And the way it syncs with numerous notes apps in the back. So that stuff that you're clipping using your finger to just grab something real quick, or as I say clipping, it's actually called snipping, which is why.
Of course, this should be snipping since it's the Snipped app.
It's fantastic.
So do you obviously there are, I'll say 100. I'm saying that metaphorically, 100 notes apps or approaches. Do you have a couple of apps that maybe you know a lot of people that use, or that you want to just suggest? And again, no, doesn't be a single one necessarily, but what are 2 or 3 that you think are very effective for the kinds of things we're talking about today?
My answer will depend on your note-taking style, and I'll just briefly describe 3 styles that most of us, one of which most of us fall into. There's the archetype or style, and if you really like to have a structured note-taking system, like to structure your ideas, you're probably an architect. And probably the most popular app for those who find themselves in that camp is an app called Notion, which gives you the opportunity to really get super structured with the notes that you keep and what you want to do.
It has a significant AI component as well.
It does. Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. Then there's the librarian, and that's somebody who just wants to be able to easily retrieve their ideas. And Evernote's been the tool I've recommended in the past. I'm not sure what Evernote's future looks like these days, but a lot of apps could fit the bill here. And as you said, there's hundreds. I would just Google Evernote alternative is probably what I would do. And then the third note-taking archetype is the one I fall into, and and maybe you do too as a farmer. It's the gardener archetype, and this is the person who wants to, rather than have a system that's top down and hierarchical with folders and subfolders, really thinks in terms of from the ground up, and wants their notes to sort of be independent of one another at first and allow them to sort of grow organically and serendipitously in a lot of ways, and not necessarily tell things where they should go, but let those things tell you down the road where they need to be. And so that's the gardener. And the app I use is called obsidian.md. And there's apps like Roam Research and others that fit the bill. And MEM is a popular one, MEM, for folks in this category. But Obsidian's the one that I have found to be my favorite. So architect, librarian, gardener, respectively, would be Notion, some sort of Evernote alternative that I haven't quite pinned down yet because I don't know what Evernote's future is.
Or even OneNote. I mean, most people would have.
Yeah.
Most people would have Microsoft. If you have the Microsoft suite, you have OneNote.
Absolutely.
So you could certainly argue for OneNote in that regard. And then there's Obsidian, and probably not surprising to people who. And thank you, Eric, for putting there snipped.com.
Yes.
Appreciate that. Probably not surprising to some people who know me. Maybe not surprising to you, Jeff. I have tried all 3, and I'm still trying to figure out Obsidian. I knew that that's your sort of personal go-to, and that's probably certainly style-wise is the right go-to for me. And again, I probably need to take your course to really help get myself over that.
I'm going to send you a link so you can take it for free. That's what I'm going to do. Is I'm going to give you a free link here later after this call and let you get in there.
Well,
and tinker around with it.
Now everybody, now see what you're doing, Jeff, is you're putting me. You're going to have everyone who's this is like on the internet forever. So now the accountability lies with Kevin because he's got no excuses.
There you go.
Now, so,
taking them away.
So there's that, everybody.
Yeah.
So beyond all of this, I'm going to ask a question about, and we've sort of gone in together into some details around this, which is great, which is fine. Which is what I hoped we would do. but let's step back. I mean, I know a little bit about your story in radio for a long time before you got into doing this, and I even know the backstory of how you really became a reader again, as I recall the story as an adult. And if we were to say, like, what's the big thing you've learned about turning learning into action? What would you say that would be?
Yeah, if I drilled it down to one thing, it's getting past this mindset that I used to have, is that I've learned something just because I've consumed something. This idea that the enemy of knowledge is ignorance is not true. It's thinking we've learned something that we haven't. In other words, the enemy of knowledge is not ignorance; it's the illusion of knowledge. Right? We can take in so much new information from dozens of sources and then think that because we've done that, we're somehow more knowledgeable. But if you're not writing it down, what you've learned, good luck, finding a way to make that information useful in the future. And by writing it down, I ultimately mean more than just, as we've talked about, capturing the concepts of the author's quote unquote verbatim. It's distilling what you've learned into your own words and written in a way anyone else can easily understand. And I said earlier, it sounds like a lot of work. It's true. When you put this kind of deliberate thought into what you capture, you'll be pickier in what you choose to keep and even what you choose to consume in the first place. So I guess in a nutshell, what I'm saying is less is more. And don't think that just because I've read 5 books on a topic, I'm an expert on that topic. You do probably know more than 90% of the public on that topic, yes, and could maybe even give a speech on it, and you'd be okay until the Q&A. And that's
exactly.
That's when we've learned you're not the expert you think you are until you've written it down. See, this idea of let me summarize it this way: if you're thinking without writing, you only think you're thinking. I'll stop there.
Well, here's how I say that, everybody. Thoughts are fuzzy. Words bring clarity. Whether those words are written, in this context, it's written, but it's also in speaking the words. Like, thoughts are fuzzy. Words bring clarity, whether they're written, whether they're spoken, whether they're both. As you were saying that, Jeff, kind of turning this back to us being in business for 30 years. Someone asked me once, several years ago, Kevin, what leadership book did you learn the most from? And I said, mine. And they looked at me like I was some sort of egomaniac. I said, no, let me be clear. You did not ask me what's the best book on leadership I've read. You asked me which book I learned the most from. And there's no question that the ones I've learned the most from are the ones I've written because of doing exactly, Jeff, what you said, translating and saying it in a new way, putting the ideas of others together and resting on their shoulders to create something that is truly different in terms of what and how it's being said. That's how we turn to sort of close us out. That's how we turn unleash knowledge from being something that's academic. And yes, we could pass the test. I love this. You might be able to give the speech, but can you do the Q&A? I love that. I'll probably steal it. I promise if I do, I will say I got it from you. I also promise you that I will be writing on the idea of selective ignorance. And I promise that I will attribute it to you. But I love that idea of it's not knowledge for knowledge's sake.
Yeah. And all those things I've talked about, I've learned from other people too, and I'm passing them along here in this context. And some of them you're hearing for the first time. They didn't all originate with me, right? They started with other people, and that's just how it works, right? And we all get to kind of put our own spin on it and teach it in our own way that resonates with our unique audience. And I would argue that you're a lot better at this than you think you are, because I just look at the number of books you've written and how relatively quickly you turn books around. That to me is the mark of someone who's gotten very good at putting knowledge into action and taking what they've learned and sharing that with other people in the form of a 50,000, 60,000 word book. It's not easy to do. and at the rate at which you do it, and they're all fantastic, you're a lot better at this than I think you give yourself credit for.
Well, I'll say thank you, and say that I'm still on a journey, and I know I can get better at it. Jeff Brown, thank you for spending the last 40 minutes with me and with everyone else out here.
My pleasure.
I know I appreciate it, and I'm confident everyone who's watching, whether they're watching live or you're watching later, they will get value from it. Again, I want to make sure you all know that you certainly want to check out Jeff's, like, if you resonated with this conversation, you will love his podcast, the Read to Lead podcast, which you can find wherever you get your podcast, readtoleadpodcast.com, or learn more about Jeff and all of the various things he's doing, including his note-taking mastery course at jeffbrown.me. Jeff, thanks so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be here, Kevin. Thank you so much.
Everybody, I hope that you enjoyed this. And if you're with us live, I'm back tomorrow at 11 Eastern with my good friend Jones Laughlin. And we're going to talk about what I've learned about leading teams over the last 30 years. That's where we're headed tomorrow. But thanks for joining us today. And I hope everyone has a remarkable rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.